Hey everyone, I wanted to take a little bit of time to explain liquid macros to you. So let's jump back over to the community macro project. And first of all, let's talk about what a liquid macro is. The intent of a liquid macro is to reduce stress for you. Before liquid macros were introduced, we had macros for each individual exam, and it made our list of macros massive, and it got to be a little stressful to try and find not only a particular issue or subject line within our list of macros, but then finding the correct one for each exam. And just to give you a little taste of that, I'll show you the project that had to be completed last April. So if you take a look here, these are the macros that were consolidated right into one, right? So with a liquid macro, we can consolidate similar issues that a student is facing, and then just consolidate it into one, and then we can call a particular macro based on a tag specific to its exam, and I'll show you a little more about that in Zendesk. But so again, fewer macros, less stress. That's the intent of liquid macros. Okay, and I'll also mention that when you're running through liquid macros, especially when you're getting started, it would be great to access the liquid macro document. So under our resources section here, if you just go to creating liquid macros, you'll find the document listed here. And I've got that called up right there. The document will look like this. At the top of the document, you'll see a friendly reminder to make sure that you address any new tickets in Zendesk that are either over 24 hours old or approaching that mark. The point being is the liquid macro project, or community macros in general, that's an internal project that we can reprioritize and kind of push to the side until a later time. Our main focus and our priority should always be to our students. So just thought I'd throw that plug in there before you decide to dive in. This won't really be much of an issue during our slower season. This would definitely be something to keep in mind during our busy season, typically between the months of July and October for sure. Okay, so getting back to it, back to the community macro project. So with hundreds of macros in Zendesk, Liquid Macros allows us to consolidate like macros and to differentiate messages based on assigned tags. It also makes it easier for Digital Genius to predict on a macro, since the machine will only have to predict one macro and doesn't have to match it for each exam. Okay, so let's take a look and see what a liquid macro looks like. So first things first, when you go to the admin section and then macros, you can very simply type in the word liquid to call up our entire suite of liquid macros, which will all have that liquid word in the actual subject or title line. So we're just going to use the very first one. So jumping into our reset stats macro, you'll take a look and see that each macro is assigned a specific tag based on its exam. So for example here, you've got praxis, and when the tag contains the word praxis, it will call this specific section, okay, of the macro. Nothing else. We have, and if you take a look, it's very long, but we have it specified per exam. So right now there should be 8 macros within this one massive liquid macro. Okay, this is also written as an if-else statement, and so it's an if-else statement. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's go over to the document here and go to, it's about almost page 2. 2 of the most common liquid markup statements that you're going to see are this one, which essentially is a statement for any macro that will have more than 2 exam macros within a liquid macro, okay? So if you think 3 and more, you're going to want to use this particular statement. If you only have 2 exams that you're working with, you'll have a much simpler statement, which is an if-else statement. Now, for those of you who don't have very much experience in coding, you don't need to worry. A lot of the syntax is just a copy paste, and then you are entering in the actual macro right below the actual line of code for this particular macro. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the if, else statement, okay? So again, a lot of our liquid macros will follow this particular programming logic so that it knows what to call up when an RC member specifically says, I need to send over for example, the reset stats macro for the GRE. So there would be a GRE tag. Let's call up, let's say, here's the tag section. I say GRE, okay? Hit enter, and there's my specific tag. I only want the GRE macro to show up. Well, with this tag, okay, there you have it. It will bring up only the macro that you need for the GRE. Don't believe me? Take a look at the links. You can always confirm that by looking at some of these links and also some of the verbiage within the macro itself. But if you wanted to do a quick test, see how it sends me directly to a GRE link. Within that liquid macro, I have links set up for each individual exam. So a student, isn't mistakenly sent over to, say, Praxis or sent over to GMAT. This particular student is only focused on GRE, so they are going to receive a link to take them to GRE-related material. Okay, so getting back to liquid macros and taking a look at the syntax. A lot of it is a copy-paste. I wouldn't worry so much about the actual syntax itself. What you need to know is that this particular syntax needs to be in there, okay? For example, here, this is your greeting. You should be familiar with that within other just basic macros that only, require one specific, item that fits for all of our exams. So just a general macro, you should have seen this already. And essentially what it's saying is that if the student doesn't have a name populated in the name field, it will just say hi there. Otherwise, it will capitalize the name of a student if they, for whatever the reason, put their name in all caps or all lowercase. That way you don't have to worry about jumping back in, fixing it to make sure it's grammatically correct. But what you need to know is that this big long line is a greeting. Copy-paste works, so go with that. And then it also will specifically say if a ticket tag contains, whether it's, say, Praxis, MCAT, LSAT, and so on, then these will be the specific statements you want to list. Now notice, here's the if portion. We always start with an if for the computer to understand for what Zendesk should call. Otherwise, everything else is followed up with an else if, and it will just continue to read through else if until it finds the correct tag to match the statement listed here. And then at the end, if it's run through all of the else if statements and it doesn't quite match, the catch-all will be this else statement here, which is essentially just a generic, it'll be just a generic macro at that point. It could be for maybe an exam that we don't quite have yet, or perhaps the tag was not appropriately added on automatically when a student sent in an email. So you might have to go back in and add that tag, and at least that generic catch-all macro will trigger you to know, oh, I better check the tags to make sure I've got the right one. This doesn't look like it's calling the correct macro. Okay, and then we always end it with a ticket.comments_formatted statement. That essentially, what that's going to do is clean up your macro. If you don't add that statement, it's actually going to add previous ticket thread history, and it looks very, very messy. So adding that statement will clean up the macro so that it ends with, it'll just end with your closer and your name. And then finally, to end the actual statement itself, you want to make sure that you have this particular statement as well. And that way, Zendesk knows it's done. It doesn't have to do anything else at the end. All right, so jumping back over to Zendesk, let's go back to the macro itself. Okay, and you'll take a look. Now there's a little more added here that I wanted to point out. Now, since the creation of the liquid macros document, there's been a little more that's been added because there were some problems that had arisen as I had learned through the liquid macro process and just kind of understanding how the syntax works. So what we've done is essentially change the if, else statement to an array. And so what will happen with this particular statement is that not only will it run through each particular macro, but it's going to only specifically look for this word. If you happen to have a tag that, and actually it's more specific to SAT and ACT, we have a tag that is called satisfaction. I'm assuming that sends out a satisfaction survey. Well, the word satisfaction has SAT within it, and it specifically says if tag, else if tags contains SAT. So it was quite literal, and unfortunately it didn't call up the right macro, and it took a while to figure out what was going on. So no, we don't want the macro to call up when it has the tag satisfaction. We just want it when it has the tag specifically SAT. And by adding this particular statement, it helps the computer understand the intent of what we're trying to accomplish. Another quick thing you should know is that the macro or the liquid macro will look for a tag between these two straight single quotations. If there is no space between it, it will not work. And so that's another thing that I've learned that I thought would be helpful to include in this video. But again, we're looking for specific tags based on the exam, and then here is the actual text or the body or portion that the student will actually see. Okay, let's see if there is anything else to note here. Jumping back to community macros, I'm going to take a look at this one here. Yes, let's talk a little bit about our simpler macro. So for a GRE or a GMAT macro, we want to take a look at the verbal only plan. Okay, so if I were to go back, there we go. There we go. First one. Okay. No need for that particular array at the top. So here's what we're looking at. In order to fix this particular macro, yes. Okay. So what had happened was with this particular macro, you have to be very, very careful with the syntax. I happened to have ticket tag. If it specifically says ticket tag contains a GMAT, it will not work. So the syntax has to be very specific. Again, you can access the liquid macro document to take a look at the syntax. A lot of it is going to be a comparison. It also helps to have someone else as a second pair of eyes to take a look and make sure that you have everything exactly as needed. And so what had happened with this particular macro was that it constantly was calling up the GRE macro no matter how many times a GMAT tag was added. And again, it was because it was just missing an S under ticket tags. And so it just automatically defaulted to the else if statement for GRE. And so, yep, there you have it. So that's another thing I wanted to show you. Lastly, what I wanted to point out was, let's say, for example, you're running through a liquid macro and you just can't quite get it to work. You've asked another RC member to take a look at it and it's not quite working. I really encourage you to access this website here, and I've included a link to it at the bottom of the document right here. So Zendesk support for liquid macros. This particular blog page not only has information about using liquid markup to customize comments and email notifications, has a uh, great active discussion going on at the bottom. In fact, you'll see that I've even posted some questions, let's see, back in July when I didn't quite understand something, and I was very fortunate to get the answers that I needed. So let's say we've exhausted all of our resources, this would be a great resource. So all you'll have to do is just post your comment below, be as specific as possible, show them what you've done. You'll have to sign in to leave a comment, but they're very responsive, and just know that, that will also, with the information up top on the actual blog post, with the Liquid Macros document, and then the option to leave a comment to ask your question, showing them that syntax and just explaining the situation, you should be all set and ready to go. So that's just a general overview of Liquid Macros. If you have questions, feel free to contact me, Sarah Seward, on Slack, or send me a direct email at sarah.magoosh@gmail.com. Otherwise, have fun creating Liquid Macros. Thanks.